What's great about this webinar series is that all the topics that we discuss are going to focus on different ways to grow your capacity to access capital. And to get us prepared, Stephanie is going to now share some quick information with you about the GoToWebinar platform. And I also want to let everyone know that we'll be recording this webinar, so you'll be able to revisit it later if you like. So I'll turn it over to Stephanie.
Hi, thank you everyone for joining us. I'd like to quickly test out the question and answer feature of our GoToWebinar platform. You can do this by typing in that question and answer feature. What organization are you representing today, and where's your organization located? Great, I can see some people answering the questions already. Thank you so much for joining us. We have quite a few people on the webinar today, and we really appreciate any participation you'd like to be involved in. So feel free to use this part of the platform to ask any questions throughout the presentation. We'll be happy to answer them.
Thanks, Stephanie. Now I'd like to go ahead and just dive into our presentation. I want to make sure and note that since the 2016 NACA NOFA isn't out yet, this is based on the 2015 NACA application. We don't foresee the fund making any significant changes to the application, so we feel pretty comfortable covering the sections the way that we are. And then, so like I said, my name's Heather Rodemaker-Taylor, and I'm joined by Crystal Langholtz. I'll let her introduce herself as well.
Hello, all.
Okay, then we'll go ahead and get started then. So first, we want to kind of gauge like where everybody is. So we're going to do a quick poll too. So has your organization ever been funded by the CDFI fund? If you could just answer quickly, we'll kind of get a good feel for how many people are experienced pros and how many people are coming to this newer. Okay, got a couple seconds to cast the last couple of votes in the poll. Okay, so we have about 79% of you saying,
yes, you have been funded by the CDFI fund.
Oh, great. That's always good to see. Okay, so perfect. Then hopefully this is helpful for you all, whether you've been funded or not. Like I said, it kind of gives us a good idea of where everybody is. So in terms of looking at the overall big picture of the application, in general, the fund's going to be looking at past performance on other CDFI fund awards. So make sure you're current on reports like the ILR, et cetera. And even if you get in reports by the NOFA deadline, it helps. Or if you can show progress towards getting certified if you have other TA awards from them, that also is going to help. Try to create or update AMIS information. AMIS used to be my CDFI fund for those of you that are already familiar. The submission is actually going to change this year, so you'll be submitting application pieces to both grants.gov and AMIS, so that's why we're kind of saying it's really good to get familiar with AMIS. Make sure you have the right contact people in there, authorized users, et cetera, or set up the account if you haven't done so already. And then for those of you that are new legal entities, make sure that you register in SAMS or grants.gov, or if you're not a new legal entity, make sure that you're not expired. And then in terms of some other tips for lending, make sure, even if you're checking after you get off this webinar, that's good, that your loan policies are board approved and have all the elements that are going to be required by the CDFI fund. Also make sure that you're going to be showing growth in your projections. For instance, your deployment ratio, if it's low, the fund's going to cut backward the amount that you ask for. The fund actually uses your actual deployment ratio to determine the FA award if you're going for the FA application. And then, are you deploying capital? Definitely available lending capital is going to matter for the application, so these are all things that you just want to make sure you're being aware of or being on top of. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Crystal to go over some additional information.
Yes, so we need to go bump on the slide there. But anyway, the fund is, the news on the street is that the fund will require our financials through December 31st. So subsequently, if you haven't closed your December 31st financials yet, and you run on accrual counting, there are still some things you can do now to make sure that your financials are as clean as possible. So, you know, print out your balance sheets now, make sure everything looks ready to go for the application. And if there is any revenue that you can at all still recognize, go ahead and recognize it in the December books to try to demonstrate a positive net income. Also with your portfolio, while it's too late to do that last-minute push to get all your loans out the door and to restructure your bad loans, it isn't too late to write off loans that should have been written off last quarter. And also make sure that your loan loss reserve allocation is in line with your policies and that your policies don't require you to over-allocate too much in loan loss reserves. So for example, a lot of what we see a lot of groups that do some sort of flat rate, like 10% or 15% on certain lending products, when they only have write-offs that are more in the 4 or 5% range. So this hurts your overall financial health, and we cannot overemphasize, for those of you who are newbies, how important your financial performance is to the fund. Your past financial performance is 40% of your scoring for FA, or was last year, and 30% for TA, meaning that you should do everything that you possibly can to get your financials as strong as possible before applying. You will automatically lose points for missing what are called MPS, which are the industry-wide minimum prudent standards, even if you have a good excuse for them. So anything you can do to try to shore up your financial health through tweaks to your balance sheet now is well worth the effort.
Thanks, Crystal. And so some more overall general writing tips for your application is make sure that you include both strong quantitative and qualitative information, so the facts and the stories. You're definitely going to want that quantitative data and those numbers that are going to be very specific and of interest to the fund. But you also want to include some qualitative information, some stories about your impact, or stories that you think will make the application more compelling to the readers. You also want to make sure that you're using market data that's at less than 5 years old, if at all possible. That's also going to make you have a stronger application. Make sure that your charts are consistent with your narrative. In fact, you're really going to want to do your financial projections first thing. They're going to inform the rest of your narrative, and you're going to, again, want everything to match. And then make sure that your projections demonstrate growth, impact, and need for an award, and we'll talk a little more about the projections a little later. Make sure that you're both specific and clear. And so what we mean by specific is, you know, don't say in your application or in one of the sections, approximately 70 people attended a financial literacy training we held. You want to say we held X amount of classes and had 67 attendees, so that they know that you're tracking this information, you're on top of things. It's very specific. And so with the TA applications, you're also going to want to connect your requested funds directly to how you're going to grow your capacity throughout the whole application. So this is going to be a thread that you return to over and over throughout the sections, and make sure that you're consistent with that. And with the FA applications, we're going to talk about this in a little more depth, but make sure that you're showing significant but believable lending growth so that you're really making the case for the funds that you're asking for. And finally, there's really limited space for stories, but like I said, that qualitative information really makes a compelling narrative. And so try to use extra space in other sections for these stories if they fit, even if they're 1 to 2 sentences. Or, you know, you'll notice as you go through the section, some of them might be repetitive, so make sure to obviously answer the questions that are asked in that section, but those can be a good opportunity to fit in those little 1 to 2 sentence stories too that will really add to your application. So now we're going to jump into another quick poll, again, for our purposes and yours. So have you ever personally written a NACA application? And we'll give you all a couple of seconds for that. Oh, okay.
Just a few more seconds to get those last votes in.
So it looks like it's close to 50-50. So we know that everybody has kind of a wealth of knowledge. So if we're leaving anything out or anything like that, we'd love to hear from y'all too. So if you have any tips to add, maybe things that have worked for you for the successful application, feel free to share them with the group now.
And we would also add that the way we are communicating how we write NACAs, we're both Heather and I are experienced NACA writers and have done pretty well in our NACA applications. The way we are walking you through this process is how we do it. So there are other ways probably of approaching a lot of these sections that we're going to go through, but we're just sharing you how we specifically do it and how what we think is in line with best practices. But we would love to hear how you approach certain sections too. For those of you out there who have written numerous NACAs.
Okay, and so I don't see any right now, but if you think of them as we go through, just feel free to kind of pop them in there, and we're happy to see those too. So perfect. So in terms of looking more in depth at each of the NACA application sections, you really have the workbook and the narrative. And like I said, most of you are probably familiar with this, but we just like to kind of go through everything and then let you know what we're going to go in depth on. So we're going to talk about the workbook, and then within the narrative, we're going to talk about the executive summary, the purpose, the products, the policies, the people, the partnerships, performance, and projection sections, and then kind of wrap it up with some final tips and Q&A. So just to give you an idea of where we're heading.
Yeah, the CDFI fund likes peas, apparently.
Yes. Perfect. So Crystal's going to talk with y'all about the workbook section now.
Sure, yes. So one of the first things that I would make sure to highlight here when walking through the workbook is that you want to make sure that your historic numbers match your audited financials. You would be surprised, actually, how often I see them where they don't match. Also, I would really strongly encourage you, as you develop out your projections, to try to demonstrate significant growth, generally more than about 5% a year. This is also a tightrope, though, because your projections also need to be believable, too. So especially if you're going to be applying for FA and asking for lending capital, your portfolio projections should look like an outgrowth of both your historical trends and your upcoming strategic goals. So for example, if you are planning to expand your target market in 2017, make sure that your lending projections match that projected growth. And that is why it is especially important to justify your growth in your narrative and have a story that ties in with what you're thinking is going to happen with your numbers. You also, and you're going to hear me say this like 35,000 times, want to make sure that your projections meet MBS. If you are very far off from meeting them now, sometimes it's better to be believable and show that you are gradually growing to meet them. We recommend showing that you meet them, however, by the third year. I would also add that most of the reviewers aren't finance people. So what they're really looking at when they look at your workbook is the financial story. So making sure that you explain your graphs in the corresponding narrative section and really give them that story and show how it ties in with the overall story of your organization. For the 10% of reviewers that really love taking into your finances, we have just kind of a couple of recommendations up there, one of them would be recommending that your change in net assets equals your net income on your chart, as that's often a surefire red flag that something went a little wonky when doing your finances, and sometimes end up not lining up in your workbook. The last little tip I would have here is on what was tab 8 last year, which is where you get to list 10 funders, you want to be listing, first of all, your largest funders here. If you have more than 10 funders, what you really want to probably prioritize is showing some diversity. So I might even include like a little community foundation grant, even if it wasn't a large grant. For example, if that is what's going to show that I have some private foundation funds, just to demonstrate that funding diversity. So those are a couple key things to be kind of highlighting in the workbook. And we're starting to have some questions come through, and some of them I'm going to wait to answer at the end. So thank you for those. We did have a question that is works with this section, which is to say, is the deploying of capital important for both TA and FA awards? So, you know, the CDFI fund all the time funds awards to groups that are just emerging CDFIs that, for example, have not deployed capital yet, and that might not be as important in that way. The thing that is most important if you are in that category, you're an emerging CDFI, what you're going to be trying to show both through your projections and in your narrative is that you are making progress towards reaching the CDFI fund certification. So the different certification criteria are the points that you are going to be hammering home if you are an emerging CDFI that has not done any lending yet. So that would be my my kind of answer to that. I hope that I clarified that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Crystal, for answering that question and for covering the workbook section. I'm going to move into looking more in depth at the narrative section now. So first you have the executive summary and the purpose. So for the executive summary, that bullet kind of says it all. It's just the facts. This section doesn't necessarily matter, and I put that in quotes, as much anymore. You really just want to answer it and kind of keep it simple and sweet. And so we're going to move on to the purpose section, which is more weighted and more important. So with this, like we say, you know, connect those specific strategic goals and the use of the award and how you're going to build that capacity to meet those goals. And then you're also going to want to connect how the use of these funds that you're asking for are going to address the target market needs and challenges in your area. And so, like I said, this section is really important. You really want to answer it well and thoughtfully and give the big picture. And then, like I said, list the strategic goals and be specific with them here. So with the strategic goals that you list, you can pick the top 3 most compelling. That's what I'd recommend. You don't really have time or space with the character limits for 5 or 6. And you can reword them, too, to fit the application, again, with that character constraint. So they don't have to match exactly how they are worded in your strategic plan. You can kind of edit them for brevity. If you don't have a strategic plan, that's fine too. You can come up with some strategic goals, like around 3, that you can kind of make sure you're consistent with throughout the application. So for example, a goal of, you know, around financial health, like improve self-sufficiency by 10% would be a good strategic goal, or increase lending by X amount over 5 years could be another good strategic goal. Those are things that you can come up with if maybe you don't have a strategic plan in place currently.
Right. And we do recommend, if you don't have the strategic plan, that one of your strategic goals might be to get a strategic plan, because the fund is very, very fond of strategic goals. So it will help you in future years to go through that strategic planning process if you don't currently have one.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then in terms of structuring this for the writing, you want to think of structuring it this way. And like I said, you know, everybody has their own ways that might work too. This is just what we recommend, and it's kind of a good way of organizing it. So think of writing it out like, you know, strategic goal 1, 2, 3. Then list the money and how you want to allocate it, the money that you're asking for, and then how these allocations help you achieve the 3 goals described. That's a really nice way to kind of think about it in terms of not getting overwhelmed by, oh my gosh, what's my big picture purpose, but in a good way to kind of think about it.
Yeah. So for example, if you're applying for you know, if you're applying for a TA award and you are asking for money to support your loan officer salary, this is the point where you get to like reiterate, yes, the portion that's going to our loan officer salary is going to support our goal to increase our portfolio by X, Y, Z. So you get to really intentionally tie those goals in with the kind of financial requests that you're making.
That's perfect, and that's why we were saying this section is so important. And then finally, like I said, with the target market needs and challenges, with these, keep your goals kind of simple and direct. So then the next section is, like I said, based on the 2015 NACA, is products. And so for this section, you really want to connect those products and services to your target market's needs that we talked about in the previous section. Like I said, it's really compelling to show need in the market and to really make your case for the funds that you're asking for. If you're going for the FA, just don't forget to address the development services. A lot of times people kind of focus on the lending funds and they forget about those services, so just try to be cognizant of that. And then in terms of demand for this, often people are general with their applications, and you really, really want to be specific with the number and the dollar amount of the loans that you have in the pipeline, inquiries that you might have coming in, market research, etc. You don't want to say about. You want to say we've had 5 inquiries come in. We have 3 loans of X amount in the pipeline. You want to be very direct here. And even if you can do a quick customer survey, do it. If you don't have market information on hand, like a quick survey monkey, or print something up and kind of try to get it done maybe within a week's time or a couple days' time. Even that'll be helpful. You also might need to tap into tribal department census information too. And you can also, like Crystal was saying, with adding the strategic plan in as developing that as a goal, you can also add on to your TA request to do additional market research if you find that that will be useful. And then finally, with the marketing and outreach, as it says here, kind of describe the specific strategies, including reaching the most underserved. With that, just really try to think about, like, how are you getting word out to maybe some of the more geographically isolated areas for those of you that are more rural or the lowest income areas, etc. And now, kind of segueing into the policy section, this section's pretty straightforward. Like I said, even if you can start doing it now, just make sure to review your policies right away to see if anything's missing and how you might mitigate that. So for the FA, if you're going for that, you really want to address all the required elements through policy or procedural documents. So if you're missing things like a loan closing checklist, you can certainly add a needed procedure, and then you can attach that procedure in additional attached documents as part of the application.
And that's a really great way, because obviously your policies have to be approved by your board, but your procedures don't. So that's a great way of making sure that you get all of those components in there if you don't think you're going to be able to get some of those specific components done through your board before you would potentially be needing to have them in the application.
And also, we kind of have a note here, also make sure to number your policy pages so they're easy to refer to and find for the reader. Remember that you want the reader to be as happy and as in good a mood as possible when they're reading your application. And so the more you can do to kind of make it easier for them, the better it'll be for you. And then if you're going for the TA and they have questions in this section, it's kind of structured a little differently, just make sure you address all the elements asked in the questions. They're pretty specific, and they kind of go through all these different portions, but it's pretty straightforward, and it usually matches most of the things that you already have in your policies. And then finally, for management information systems, we have here kind of addressing underwriting or financial statements or impact tracking, all those kind of things. For this section, make sure that you're listing all the software, no matter how simple it is, even if you're using Excel. And these might be things like, our loan software, Down Home, we're using QuickBooks, we're using the customer jobs function of QuickBooks. So anything you can do here to kind of just show you're on top of things, you're a good steward of the organization, and keeping track of all the things that you need to keep track of as part of the CDFI would be good here. And so now we're moving into another section. We're moving into the people section, which is section 4. So this part is also pretty simple. For the FA application, it's usually not a narrative, really. It's just filling out a chart. And if it's a TA application, it's really just one section, one question, which is why I said it's pretty simple. So with the chart or the table, usually it gives you 5 slots to list staff. And so you really want to list them in order of importance and include contractors if they were completing key functions for your organization, so that you're making sure that you're addressing all duties of the CDFI, whether it be lending or management or fundraising or anything like that. Just make sure that you're covering all that information. So for instance, let's say you have 6 staff members and the 6th person is the lending officer. You might want to bump them up into those 5 slots, again, to make sure you're just covering all of the key functions of a CDFI. You don't want to make it look like you have any kind of glaring gaps. And again, with the board, same thing. Make sure that you kind of have a combination of members that are addressing those key qualifications and functions of a CDFI. Like we said, whether it's target market accountability or fundraising or financial management, make sure to include people with qualifications you may be missing, so there again aren't any kind of glaring gaps. And so that between contractors, board members, and staff members, you're kind of covering everything that you can possibly cover. And then finally, with the committees, like we said, it's good to have those finance committees and others just depending on the size of your organization, but really make sure that you're listing at least the loan committee. That's something that the fund's really going to be looking at. So just make sure to include that and have that in general for your CDFI.
Okay, so then we would go to the partnership section. Heather's going to talk a little bit about all the different kinds of things that go into the partnership section. But one of the things that's important in this section early on is where you need to express your CDFI fund award leverage as a ratio. And I just wanted to add that there is no established way to do this. This ratio is, for example, where you're saying that we're going to get the CDFI FA money, and we're going to take that $800,000 and we're going to leverage it 4-to-1 or 3-to-1 through the different debt capital that you could potentially access with that money and other kinds of resources that you would bring in having the CDFI fund award. And we did some research with OESA, and we found that most of our native CDFIs really have great leverage ratios. So let's woo, show that off. But below, I've given you 2 examples of different ways that you could potentially try to get this award leverage to show as a ratio. And one is done here as just total assets, and then one is done using revenue and lending capital raised. And because there is no required specific way to do this, I actually recommend trying it a couple different ways, specifically from your projections, and then using the best leverage ratio so that you can make the most of that section. Just make sure that you do it consistently the same way throughout. But anyway, you'll have these slides so that you can do some experimentation yourself.
Perfect, thanks. And like Crystal said, I was going to add a little more onto the partnership section. So again, make sure that you use the same calculations for historic leverage rates as you used for your projected. In fact, you can just pull these right off the workbook tab from your projection section. And then really, this is important, provide details about each partnership. Don't just list a bunch of partners. It's better to go deeper here. You really want to talk about the relationship, how you're working together, kind of those meaty details that are going to show how this partnership actually enriches the work of the organization. And so instead of maybe listing like 10, you might want to go into detail about a couple and really kind of flesh that out. And finally, also try to link those partnerships directly to your strategic goals that we talked about in section 1. So, how are those partnerships helping you achieve those goals or helping you support those goals? And then finally, again, if you have room, include how this directly impacts the client's life. So again, this is an opportunity to work in that little qualitative 1 to 2 sentence story piece that I was talking about. It really works well in this partnership section. And so, yeah, I think that those would be some good tips as you work through section 5. And then Crystal is actually going to talk to you about the next 2 sections, which are performance and projections.
Okay, so the next section of the narrative is the financial performance section. And then, as I mentioned, this is a huge part of your NACA application. This is the area where you get to address each of your MPSs and separately and address why each one is strong strong or weak. And we recommend not really writing this out in the specific question when you guys see this and it comes out. I don't generally actually write out in a full narrative here. What I actually usually do is list out the MPS and then talk about whether or not we met it or didn't meet it, and explaining why I didn't meet it. And I like to do that also so that it lines up with the order on the chart, just so that I'm making this super easy for reviewers. As Heather said, we want them to love us, so the more you can do there, and that also will save words for you. So you want to make sure that you address each of those MPSs, that they all make it in there, and I usually just do that more in a bulleted fashion than a long narrative fashion. I wanted to address some of our most ugly MPSs that we see in the industry. So first of all, if you don't meet the self-sufficiency MPS, you are not alone. You have friends. You will lose points. There's no way around it. But you also get a chance to talk about why that is. So you need to communicate. If you're in a rural area, you need to explain that it's harder to meet self-sufficiency MPS because of your target market size, and oftentimes the fact that you have to provide a lot of services in an urban environment that you could hypothetically have out on referral. So make sure that you provide information there, and when you have, if you do provide any of those specific services on a contractual basis, you want to make sure that those got categorized as earned income and not grant income on your balance sheet, so that you can make sure that it's going to increasing your self-sufficiency ratio. So that's, as I talked about kind of at the beginning, was just sort of making sure that your balance sheet looks really good from the very beginning. That's some of the kinds of work that you could be doing right now. I would also add that if you have a lot of depreciable assets on the past NACAs, that has hurt your self-sufficiency ratio. So you might want to explain, for example, that you own your own building, and that depreciation, if you take that out, if you take out that depreciation from your expenses, then you're doing much better on your self-sufficiency. And we did have a question come in that I wanted to address. Okay, great. We had a couple questions that came in here. So we had one of the questions that came in was, what is MPS? And I'm sorry that I explained a little bit at the beginning, but I should have spent a little bit more time there. MPS are the industry minimum prudent standards, and they are the recommended, so for example, across the industry, you look at a variety of different subjects like self-sufficient, like how much income do you earn every year from your lending and from your contract services. They would look at your net income. Are you having positive net income? And they would look at, how much delinquencies you have in your portfolio. And all of those have suggested ratios that are across the industry for what the CDFI fund is expecting you to show as a CDFI. And so those minimum prudent standards are very important and are part of what the CDFI fund is looking at when they are evaluating your financial performance, and because they are comparing you to what they expect to see across the entire industry. So that was one of the questions that was asked. The other one here that we had show up was, what will the CDFI fund require audited statements for an FA application? So that's a good question, Ray, and I believe the answer is yes. I will double check though, and that information will go into the overall email that we're going to send out. As far as I know, all the FA applications I've ever written have had audited statements, so I'm almost 80% sure that that is true, but I will verify that, and that will go out in the email that we're going to send out.
Was there one more question? Okay. Okay. And then, like we said, the next section will be the projection section, and Crystal's going to go over that too for us.
Okay, regarding projections, I already spoke them kind of in depth when I went through the workbook section. So I'm going to be a little brief here, but I'll say again, really tie those projections back in with your workbook. And make sure that, as I said, you meet NPS by year 3. In general, just make sure that the overall numbers make sense and are cohesive. For example, if you're projecting tons of lending growth, you need to project at least a bit of an increase in operational expenses. So obviously, we all hope that we can scale up our lending without huge growth in our expenses, but let's just try to be realistic. So make sure that they all cohesive. And make sure to list each NPS and make sure that you know how you're achieving them. And lastly, usually there's a section about programmatic risk where they ask you to identify and address how you are mitigating those risks. So we recommend in that section that you would usually pick 2 or 3 tops here and really be thoughtful around them. So definitely feel free to be honest about the things that keep you up at night. So for example, if you're a small team, losing key staff is always a concern, but you could potentially mitigate those risks through cross-training your team members, or having summer interns. Get creative around how you're going to mitigate those risks. But the main point here is to pick up a few and really address your plan. Oh, thank you, Phoebe. We had a good. She's adding some tips herself, which that's the spirit of this. And she says, regarding the workbook, applicants really need to double check every formula. Last year, the projected averages didn't work, and there were a couple other errors as well. And she is so very, very right. And how the CDFI Fund usually deals with this is actually we're usually the ones, the NACA writers are usually the ones that discover them, and then we call the CDFI Fund and are like, oh my gosh, this isn't working, the formulas aren't working. And so what ends up happening is they will issue these little blurbs throughout the rest of throughout the grant writing cycle that just say, for example, this area of the workbook doesn't work, we want you to do this in this experience. And just so you know, we do in our newsletters share those as they come out, just like, hey, your workbooks don't work. And of course, we only send out our newsletter once a month. So you want to, if you are seeing those kinds of errors or you're confused when those errors start to occur, you kind of want to be monitoring the CDFI Fund's communications around those issues. And of course, be in touch. Amber Kuchar is like the coolest gal. She's very responsive, and she will definitely address those issues. And if you do run into any of those issues, and you're always welcome to reach out to Heather or I too, and we can let you know if we've heard specifically how any of those things work. Yes. Oh, and Natalie Charlie from Talafund representing. She also adds regarding the audited financial question. If you are starting out and they have a sponsoring entity, you would use the sponsoring entity's audited financials. So that is a very very helpful thing to add in there. So thanks, Natalie, for that. Oh, and I did on the last slide. I do think I forgot to address. That when it comes to your deployment ratio, you do get to, there is no industry-wide specific way that you have to configure how you are allocating your assets available for lending. So obviously, if you have money that's specifically required to stay in your loan fund, or you have a note that needs to stay in your loan fund, obviously, ethically that goes into the assets allocated for lending. But otherwise, there is a little bit of wiggle room about how you approach approach your assets available for lending. So where you can, ethically, I think it's totally within the bounds of how this is normally done to try to push down those assets available for lending to look like you need additional capital for deployment. You know, obviously, you know, you do that to the degree that you're able to do that, but there is a little bit of wiggle room there. So I just wanted to add as far as how to, as far as some of the ways that you can try to keep those MPS ratios that I was talking about and make them look in line with other issues. Another question that came up here with regarding some of my acronyms, I'm rocking here, and this is, I would just add that this is a very intense and very specific look at the application. You know, we went for intense and kind of focused content here. You know, I apologize if we haven't done a lot as far as kind of the basics of NACA and kind of went for very intentional focus looking at the specifics of each section instead. So thank you for those of you who are keeping me honest and asking these questions. So, but the question that came up was, what is your PAR, which is one of the acronyms on this page, and that is your portfolio at risk. So you'll see here we have the 30 plus or 60 plus. And that is asking, and that's basically associated with your delinquencies at all of those different stages, what percentage of your portfolio is at risk at those different junctures. So you might have different goals associated with all of this. And there's certainly industry-wide goals, which are your minimum prudence standards. In this section also, you are going to be asked to make sure that you list any internal health ratios that you have that are not MPS. So generally those are going to be ones that are going to be a little bit higher, a little bit more stringent maybe than the industry-wide standards. So for example, in the financial area, you might have some financial goals such as funder diversification. You might also have a few portfolio management ones where you are doing a little, trying to show that you are a little bit better than the MPSs. So in general, I would just say that the native CDFIs actually generally perform very well in portfolio management, oftentimes exceeding MPS. So here's your chance to shine in that specific area. And you know, if you don't meet those MPSs now, you certainly get to address how you are trending positively towards meeting them, or how you are addressing any concerns that they're highlighting in there. And then I would just, I think I covered everything there. Does anybody have any last questions about the projections or the performance measures here? You can go ahead and use your hand or use the chat function. Okay, and as if you think of them as we're going, still, as we're finishing out here, that's totally great. But hopefully I gave a good kind of overview of what they are looking for in this section.
Perfect. Thanks, Crystal. So as you can see, we've made it through the application pieces, which is great. So that being said, we just want to kind of wrap it up with some final tips, which a lot of them kind of seem redundant or really apparent, but they're just really, really good to hammer home. So first of all, address any obvious weaknesses in your application. So whether they be MPS, like Crystal was saying, you know, obviously you're going to lose points if you don't meet an MPS ratio. But you know, you have the opportunity to kind of address that, or address any kind of trends, how you're mitigating them, how you're going to be, you know, addressing them through the funds that you're asking for, anything like that. Just kind of any place that you think there might be a gap, just try to make sure to kind of try to shore it up or provide extra information that really makes the case to the reader. And then in terms of sources, again, like I said, it might be apparent, but just make sure that you cite all your sources, whether, you know, you have to do it in the application just because of the formatting, but just try to keep it simple, whether it's the Census Bureau, if it's you, or if it's the Tribal Housing Authority. Make sure to put that in there. And then, again, we can't stress this enough, answer all the questions asked, which may seem obvious, but sometimes you never know. You either might skip a question, or the bigger thing would be reading the questions really carefully. And so making sure that if it's a question with several parts, that you answer all the different parts of the question there. You don't want to lose points for something kind of simple like that you could have addressed. And then don't do it alone. So if possible, like we were saying, reach out to partners or staff members, board members. You can reach out to Crystal or me. You can potentially, if you have a question for the CDFI fund, so try to reach out to people for assistance and feedback where you can. And then again, we kind of said this throughout too, but just make sure you're clear and concise. You're just make sure you're addressing the questions and not taking up any additional room, because really you can use that additional room for those extra stories, those extra pieces that are going to make the application a little more compelling. And then this kind of goes along with what we were saying about checking the workbook, but just always double and triple check your math. Again, you don't want to lose points on something that you could have just easily found and corrected, especially if it's something that's then going to affect other parts of your application with your numbers and figures. And finally, make sure that you submit early if possible. This is huge, especially as somebody who's submitted several grant applications, and I'm sure a lot of you will feel the same pain. It's huge for cutting down on stress and avoiding or addressing potential submission issues that you do not want to face an hour before the application is due, especially when other people are probably trying to submit at the same time, and you definitely don't want that to be something that holds up your submission altogether and puts your whole application in jeopardy. So for peace of mind, submit early is very critical. And then finally, I'll let kind of Crystal elaborate on this more, but it's really important to kind of know your story, especially when you're going into this and what you're going to be saying.
Yeah, so, I've written a lot of NACAs, and I would just say that, some of those NACAs I've written are like the little CDFI that could, like they're starting up and they're, and that can be a really compelling story. You can also have a story about a larger CDFI that's working on their self-sufficiency, and you can have the story of your expanding your target market so that you can serve more people and make a broader impact in your community. But I would just say that the best NACA applications are ones that really have a story that they're trying to tell about their organization and about their community. So kind of think about that, especially for CDFIs who have maybe some damage history. They've had a bad spell and are trying to come out of that. Knowing. Even being honest with their story about the executive director that left and how they're rebuilding, even being transparent around issues, if you can make that part of your story in a way that that is, helping you, obviously, get in line with CDFI industry standards, it's going to be great, and it's gonna work. Yeah, that's what I would just say about the power story, even in this very structured format that the CDFI fund uses. And there was another question that came in from the very beginning from Phoebe, which was regarding the NOFA. So at the beginning, Heather did reference that we were anticipating the NOFA coming out at the end of January, and that was from an initial press release that was held several months ago by the CDFI fund, and last time I checked in December, it was still standing. But that does not mean that something hasn't changed. It's much easier to say something is coming out in January and December than it is to say that it's coming out in January and January. That being said, I will do some reconnaissance work, and I will check with the CDFI fund to see if I can find some more detailed information about whether or not it will actually be, January 31st. We were expecting very end of January, or whether it's going to be sometime a little bit later this quarter, and maybe you have just a little bit more time to prepare and get yourself ready.
Perfect. Yay. Thanks, Crystal. And so we're going to move on to question and answer section. If there were any questions that that kind of came up for you and you didn't type them in, or anything you feel like maybe we didn't touch on or cover, or you wanted a little more information on, feel free to use the chat function or the question function or your hand function and just shoot them over to us now, and we're going to give you a second to put those in. Okay, well, we're not seeing any pop up. I mean, y'all were pretty good about asking them throughout the presentation, so give you just a couple more seconds.
While we're doing that, I would just add a little bit here to say that I know that some of the things that we said were very specific, and so they may be hard it may be hard to sort of think through them, you know, without an application right in front of you. So I just would hope that this would serve as something that maybe you could reference when the application comes out, and you could specifically be pulling up sections and, you know, going through and listening through them, because the presentation will be available. So we are going to send out a copy of the PowerPoint that this goes with, and some follow-up information, clearly, from some of your great questions that came up. As well as, so we'll have the audio that you can listen to time and time again for your listening pleasure. Oh, we did have some additional questions come up. Okay, is the REIS still available to contract with us to assist with the application? Thanks. Oh, that's from Natalie. Yeah, Natalie, unfortunately, we currently have all of our slots filled. Heather, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes. So we do, because we have such demand every year to help with writing applications, we do usually have that go through actually it's a competitive process, and then we actually have all of our contracts currently in place. We could double check and make sure that we wouldn't have the ability to do a review still, because we did have quite a few review slots available as well. But yes, if the contract falls through, though, I'm making a mental note that you're interested, and we can make sure that that we reach back out to you for that. Okay, so another question that came in is, this may have been asked, we just received a NACA as a sponsoring entity. Do we need to complete the certification process to apply? Yes, to applying again. The answer to that is no. You are eligible to apply up to 3 times for TA awards without being certified. And the reason for that is that you have, you basically have, in your assistance agreement, it usually will give you 2 years to become certified from when you get your assistance agreement. So that usually ends up being 3 3 TA awards that you're eligible to potentially apply for. That being said, you want to be showing progress towards receiving certification, and you also want to make sure that you can be showing that you have made some good headway towards certification, to really think through doing another application. Is certification required for an FA application? Yes, Ray. Certification is required for an FA application, or to be more specific, it is required that you would have applied for certification by the time the NOFA comes out. There's usually a certain cutoff date that's associated with when you have to apply for certification. And to clarify, we kind of just jumped right into it, but the TA awards go up to $150,000, and those are usually for operating funds meant to grow your capacity. So for contracting funds, for staff salaries, different things like that would be under those TA awards. Equipment, anything that's going to help build your capacity as an organization. The SA awards are for lending capital as well as for the associated operating funds in the same way as TA. But those generally go up to $1 million. Obviously we'll see exactly what the specific rules that come out that are associated with it with the NOFA this year. But those are generally the limits. But you do have to be certified or have applied by certification by a certain date to, I think it's usually within 90 days of the NOFA coming out to be eligible for SA. Yes. Okay, in reference to the last TA question, if awarded a TA, can we apply for up to 2 years in a row? You certainly can. Yep. Absolutely. At least you could, and that is something, at least you could last year, right? And that is something to be specific about, that the NOFA is going to specifically say eligibility requirements. So, just because this has historically been the way it is, what you want to do is when the NOFA comes out is you want to read who's eligible to apply, yeah. And then that will verify that for you. But historically, yes, you can apply 2 years in a row. And then the last question that's popped up here, for organizations who do not have audited financials, how do these entities support the application with credible unaudited financials? Yeah, that's a great question, Cindy. Obviously, if you're applying through a sponsored entity, that works well. You can use the sponsored entity's financials. However, I do know that with so background on me, I was an executive director of a startup CDFI, and I do know that we just used our QuickBooks, we did, but then in our TA applications we included things like our audit to show that we had the strong desire, right? And then of course when you do your financial management, when you're writing your MIS stuff in there, as well as when you're talking about your financial management policies and practices, that's your time really then to say and acknowledge, we don't have an audited financials. We're only doing TA. We just started, blah, 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 but we plan on doing this, and we expect by this date to have audited financials, and we love audited financials. We want to snuggle audited financials. That would be my recommendations there. Okay, great. So how do we request the workbook? So that'll be part of your when the NOFA comes out, it's going to have all the application materials there that you can download, and the workbook will be one of those downloadable applications. I can, of course, and what I think I will do is I will include last year's NOFA as well as their workbook so that you can see what the workbook looks like in advance. And we debated whether or not we were going to be jumping back and forth and showing you on previous old applications specifically what these things look like, and realized that we didn't have the time, so I apologize for that. But we will attach them so that you can sort of just enjoy kind of getting a sense of what that'll look like before it comes out. But that will be part of the application materials when it comes out. You download it as an Excel workbook.
Perfect.
Okay.
Well, I'm not seeing any additional questions, so I'm hoping that we answered everything or provided all the information you might have been interested in. Oh, wait. Is the app? We had one more question come in. Sorry, is the application on your website? No, it's not. Usually it's going to be on the CDFI Funds website, but like you said, like Crystal just said, we can send you the last year's application in NOFA so that you can have that to reference. But when it comes out for 2016, it'll be on the CDFI Funds website.
Right. It will also, we will most assuredly be putting that out on our Facebook feeds, as well as our newsletters, all those things like that. We are very, we love to tell the story of the CDFI Fund applications coming out. So you will be hearing from us around that time, for sure. But that is something that the CDFI Fund puts out, not us.
Perfect. Okay. So first, we just want to make sure that we let y'all know about the next upcoming webinar. We're doing financial coaching with Change Machine, Tuesday, February 23rd at 1 p.m. Mountain Time. And you can visit our website and see registrations in the event section. And I believe it was also in our newsletter that came out. So just wanted to make sure that we brought your attention to that. But thank you, everyone, for participating in this webinar. I hope we provided information that will be useful to your organizations. I wanted to make sure and point out that a very brief survey should pop up when you close this webinar. Please, please fill it out. It helps us track this webinar series and make sure that we continue to improve and, provide you with better and better webinars. So please do that and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.